Hi everyone. It's the first Saturday of April 2022, and this is the weekly broadcast. So last week we talked about human systems and how they have two primary characteristics. Firstly, systems must grow or else they will be replaced by other systems that grow. And secondly, systems reach diminishing marginal returns based on its unchangeable internal and external parameters. We talked about the global order being one big system made up of little systems based on the trade of oil, and contextualizing it within these grand cycles of centralization and specialization that cause growth, the need for growth, and the impossibility of sustaining that needed growth, as well as some of the factors that marked the latter stages of these processes during the Bronze Age and the Roman Age. Civilization is like a big system that is held together by the belief that further cooperation can lead to further mutual benefits. If you think about it, any system, whether it be countries or companies or even groups of friends, is based on this conditionally cooperative principle. When the big system stagnates because of diminishing marginal returns, the subsystems start to consume each other as allies turn into enemies over scarcity, the truth of which is realized by the observation that there is less and less to be gained from cooperation between subsystems. And by the time we reach this point, which we certainly have, the only reforms we could make without tearing down the big system ourselves would be to merely rearrange the deck chairs on this great unsinkable Titanic, as the lower decks are just about finished flooding, and the much better option is to try to beat the crowd to the lifeboats. And finally, we talked about how the grand solar cycle could increase the likelihood of what we consider to be low probability weather events that reduce food production, which is a much more difficult problem to solve than it seems. Maybe if I have enough time, I can start talking about the current emergency level problems with the global food supply, from which no one, regardless of your country of residence or your level of wealth, is immune. Now, I want to start this week's broadcast by just making a minor correction from last week's broadcast, which is the distinction between money and currency. So traditionally, we talked about salt as money, and then paper certificates coming to represent whatever store of value that a society had decided upon based on certain characteristics of that thing. So in that case, the thing that is the commodity, the salt or the gold or the silver, is the money, and the paper that represents that money is the currency. So there's a difference between money and currency. And technically, when I say that governments are creating money or printing money, they're actually printing and creating currency. It's just that it's common practice to refer to the currency as money now, because of certain terms such as the money supply, velocity of money, terms that are used in economics. And perhaps some of these terms are promoted specifically to obfuscate the fact that we don't have real money anymore. We only have currency. Now, another so people might think that what I just said in terms of the meaning between money and currency is a matter of, petty linguistic prescriptivism, and that, meanings of words do change over time, and you do have to accept the fact that that is a natural process, and you can't really hold words to their old meanings when society has shifted and we all have a common understanding of a new definition of a word. But sometimes it actually makes a practical difference. So I have one good example of this, which is the meaning of the word right. So what is a right? You can pause this video and ask yourself for a second. What is the meaning of the word right? What is a right? What kinds of things do I have the right to? What kinds of things are universal rights? And you might come up with, the right to free speech, or the right to, the freedom of religion, the right to freedom of whatever it is. You might also maybe say you have a um, right to medical care, a right to a decent wage. You might come up with, uh, any sorts of rights, and it might make it seem like the matter of what is a right and what is not comes down to a pure matter of opinion. But this is also because that the word itself has been obfuscated. So originally, if you have a right, what a right does is it assigns a corresponding duty to everybody else in order not to interfere with that right. So the reason why freedom of speech is a right and not a privilege is because the freedom of speech imposes a duty towards a duty for everyone else not to interfere with that freedom of speech. And obviously, um, that creates this distinction between what is known as a positive duty and a negative duty. And so the idea of rights to begin with is that it restricts the actions of others to maintain your own freedom. So it assigns what is called a negative duty to everyone else. So what I mean by that is I have a freedom of speech. You have a duty not to do something. And what is that duty not to do something? It's the duty not to interfere with my rights. Now that we've basically perverted the meaning of this word and we consider things like a decent wage or medical, healthcare to be rights, this basically opens the door to infinite government expansion, infinite erosion of freedoms. Basically, the word right becomes meaningless, and as a result, it sets us down the path of actually losing all the rights that we need to have. So let's take the right to healthcare, which is a popular one, I believe. So, what does a right to healthcare do in terms of the duty of others, right? So, maybe you compare it to the previous example and you say, um, the right to healthcare means that it assigns a duty to everyone else not to interfere with your right to get healthcare. I mean, I would agree with that. I would agree with, the government and other people shouldn't get in your way when you're exercising your freedom to seek medical attention by whatever means. But the problem is that the way that this right is commonly conceptualized is that you have the right to force the government to pay for your medical treatment. So that's, a totally different ballgame because now you're going into a positive duty. Instead of you having a right to other people not doing something, you're now having a right to other people doing something. So that is basically coercion, right? And once you go down that path, you can see how quickly that uh, brings a situation where you have this false balancing act between such a like you have makes it seem like you have to balance people's individual economic freedom with people's freedom to have healthcare. So it doesn't really make sense to have the freedom to have healthcare because what are you being free from? The lack of healthcare, but the lack of healthcare is the base state, right? So, anyways, the main topic I wanted to start with in this broadcast proper is the idea of moral hazard. So, you can look up what the actual definition of moral hazard is. I'm sure there's some geeky economic definition, but the way that I think about what moral hazard means is that it is the derogation of proper responsibility. So, in a society, the bearer of the potential gain of an action should be the bearer of the corresponding risk, right? He who takes the risk should bear the consequences of that risk, right? Because the person who takes the risk is the one who has the control to prevent that risk taking. And that way, everybody has the incentive to assess the risks that they take properly and act accordingly. That seems like common sense, right? I'm going to go on a little tangent here about common sense because the centralization processes want to kill common sense. The left is too much against common sense traditionally, and the right is too much in favor of common sense traditionally. So, I mean, the thing is with the right is that um, you do have to have some room to question your common sense. Like sometimes there are good scientific studies that show with clear data that are um, what we might think at first glance is not correct. So we have to consider that and basically integrate the conclusions that are sufficiently supported into our common sense plus, right? The I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Maybe an example might be like an oversimplification, such as poor people deserve to be poor because of whatever reason. Um, and then the left, they are too much against common sense. They want to basically say, and I'm going to talk in broad strokes here. They want to say, don't trust your eyes, trust the experts, right? Because you don't really understand anything really. Common sense. Common sense is what? Common sense is racism. Common sense is sexism. Common sense is all of that kind of stuff that we need to basically beat out of ourselves. So that is kind of my brief argument for. It's not really an argument. It's just my brief illustration of how I see this tendency of one side of the traditionally conceptualized political spectrum being too much against common sense and the other side being too much for common sense. Um, and now that we have this kind of over centralization force that's eating up society, you kind of have this narrative come from above that says, don't believe your eyes, believe the propaganda, even if it's blatantly wrong, right? Russia is to blame for increasing food prices and increasing gas prices, even though they were, long on the rise before the invasion, and the effects of the invasion haven't really had a chance to really kick in a significant way, even. And I saw this segment on YouTube where they did street interviews for on people for why they thought that the gas prices and food prices were increasing, and a lot of people said it was Russia, and I mean I'm talking about perverse incentives here, so I'll just mention that you know that means that Russia is proving to be such a good scapegoat for all of these problems that government had already caused before the invasion. Let's never mind the topic of whether or not the government actually caused the invasion. Um, it kind of kills the incentive for the government to de-escalate or try to end the war in any real way, now doesn't it? So, so a couple of topics here. So the first one is insurance. So insurance is the context in which moral hazard as a concept is normally thought about. So the idea is that in economics, whatever insurance system that you have to the justifications for having an insurance system it, based on utilitarian grounds is a totally different subject. But once you have decided that you want insurance in a certain aspect of society, you have to design that insurance system so that it doesn't create this moral hazard, this derogation of proper responsibility, right? Because let's say if my wallet is insured, then I have less incentive theoretically to take care of it and to stop it from being lost. If I have car insurance, technically, theoretically, I have less of an incentive to um, make sure that my doors are locked or to make sure to drive carefully. If my home is insured, maybe theoretically I would be less careful about making sure that it doesn't burn down. I know that, obviously there are other reasons to prevent your car and your house from being lost. And insurance systems do actually have measures to prevent that. But broadly speaking, in a society, since the whole purpose of insurance is to um, shift the risk from the risk bearer to a third party, this adds up in the whole of society. right? So like how many different kinds of insurance are there, and how many of those kinds are mandatory? How many of those kinds, never want to pay you once, they actually owe you something? Um, but the the general idea is that you're taking risk away from the people who are bearing that risk more and more, until you have a society that more and more people aren't responsible for the consequences of their own actions. Um, Now, another area that you might consider this concept in is welfare. So, a lot of times, people, mostly on the right, will argue that if you increase, well, correctly, that if you increase welfare too much, then you're going to kill the incentive to work, right? Because when a person decides to work, I know there's all sorts of psychological factors, conscious, subconscious, involved in any sort of decision making made by a complicated human being. But simply speaking, when somebody is deciding whether to work or to not work, there's a sort of cost benefit analysis done. So the cost, the effort to actually do the job, to find the job, to get the job, those are all costs, and the benefits obviously is the pay. But also in the costs, you have to consider the opportunity costs. So um, if the government is offering me $100 a week if I don't work, and $0 a week if I do work, and I can work $200 a week by working, then the difference between working and not working isn't between $200 a week and $0 a week. The difference is between $200 a week and $100 a week. In that case, then I would have to implicitly value the effort of me finding the job, getting the job, doing the job as being, on average, under $100 a week. Because if I thought that the implicit cost of that was over $100 a week on average, then it's not. It's better for me overall to just stay home, get the $100 a week less, and not incur those costs and efforts. Another area, um, another area is in banking. So, uh, the modern economic paradigm is what we call Keynesian economics, where the government spends money to support the economy when it comes from this correct underlying idea that the economy goes through cycles, and cycles of economic growth, cycles of economic contraction. And the idea with Keynesian economics is to try to smooth over those cycles by having the government save money when the economy is good. I mean, as if that's ever going to happen. And then spend money when the economy is bad to try to smooth things over. This is why whenever you see the economy go into recession, they lower the interest rates, they do all of this government spending, and then the government goes into more debt, and then the central banks monetize that debt by printing money, printing currency. Sorry. Um, Now, with banking, so one term that kind of came into the popular zeitgeist around the 2008 financial crisis was this idea of too big to fail, right? Once you have a government that has put itself in the position of um, making sure that the economy doesn't get too bad, through this Keynesian economic idea, then you get this phenomenon of too big to fail. What happens is, um, okay, going back to every system is designed to grow, right? So I talked about society as a system, but companies and banks and all of these things are systems within that system, and they are also designed to grow. And they you have what's called economies of scale, where in certain businesses you can do the job more efficiently at a lower cost, and so at a lower profit margin when you have more volume of business, like you're bigger. So um, an example might be if two big construction companies merge, then obviously you have the other factor of the fact that um, this new company has a greater market share, so they have a greater influence on the market. But the other thing is that you get what's called economies of scale, where now you can share resources, and now these two systems have become one system. So now the resource allocation between um, you don't have to have a separate resource allocation between one system and another system. You have one system where you can share resources and allocate them across both halves of these new system, which in this example is this merged company. And this is exactly why mergers happened in the first place, because um, obviously being a bigger fish in this ocean is advantageous because more um, you basically have more influence of your surroundings. Now, the too big to fail thing comes in because all of these systems within the system grow, but they don't always grow in the way that is the most efficient for society. And now, when that comes to fruition, what happens is the economy goes into recession, and basically the growth isn't working, so it breaks down because the growth isn't good enough in quality, not necessarily quantity, as measured by numbers of dollars. So the economy starts breaking down so that companies that are less efficient, they made wrong decisions, they centralized incorrectly, they can be broken down. And then that market space is available for new actors to come in, whether it be, so let's say you have a big construction company go out of business. Um, you would have all of those jobs that would have been taken by that construction company would now be taken by new construction companies, or existing construction companies would grow to fill in the gap. And sometimes you get this argument of, um, well, like if this big company goes down, then you're losing so many jobs, and that's bad for the economy. And that is true, but in the short term. But in the long term, what happens is all of those, for example, this construction company that goes out of business, all those workers that are laid off, they are going to be able to find jobs in these new construction companies that come to fill the space, or the old construction companies that grow to absorb the space. So the jobs aren't just missing; they're temporarily missing. It's what's sometimes referred to as frictional unemployment, and those jobs are still there in the economy. Maybe they will take some time to surface as the market adjusts. But when the government comes in and bails out the big construction company, first of all, they're creating um, a financial burden on the entire society as a whole that can never go away. Because the way that government spending works is, like I keep saying, systems are meant to grow. So government spending will, it's really, really hard to reduce government spending. Once the government fills a space, it really um, doesn't want to give that up, because in order to give it up in a way that actually is stable for the major actors involved, is to do it um, extremely slowly, and nobody can really have the discipline or foresight to do that. And even if you look at East Germany, where everybody was basically employed by the government, um, even now a lot of people work for the government. If you compare East Germany to West Germany, it's just really, really hard to change for a lot of reasons. The work culture, the economic climate, the investment climate. The thing is, when the economy is so used to the government controlling the market, that creates greater risks in terms of investment. So people will tend to invest in less risky areas. So then you have this vicious cycle of, um, because of the government, you have less investment, and because you have less investment, you need the government to do more things, so on and so forth. So um, that's one thing. But now the other thing is, well, it's related too, because once you bail out this big construction company, in my example, then you actually have to keep bailing it out, because chances are the reason why this big company is going out of business is There's a lot of underlying problems that just didn't get fixed properly under whatever system that that company was running on. So now it's time for that system to die and for other systems to arise so that they can compete with each other and we can, as a society, move closer towards creating better systems. But now that you've propped up this, failing system because of this perceived need to, now you have to keep propping it up. And it becomes kind of like an infinite money hole. But the other thing that it does to more closely related to moral hazard is that it actually prevents companies from having a greater incentive to make sure that their systems are optimized in terms of efficiency and in terms of their ability to reform to adapt to their changing environment. Um, so this big construction company, maybe if the company knew that it was living um, in a society where the government is savage, it'll let you fail like it should, then it'll probably be more careful in terms of making sure that it doesn't go out of business. Whereas if the company knows that the government is basically pussy and has to bail you out if you go under because of political expediency, then you're gonna take all sorts of risks that you might not otherwise take because who cares if you go out of business? You won't go out of business. The government will bail you out. And that's what happened with some of these big banks in the 2008 financial crisis. Now, the thing with doing business is that it tends to be that the higher the risk, the higher the reward. Um, and the reason is simple. It's because um, the more risky things for a society to do have to have a higher price assigned to it. Otherwise, it isn't worth that risk being taken. So we kind of have this implicit mechanism in the free market that um, assigns like a profit premium to greater risk. But what happens under moral hazard is because that risk is being outsourced to a third party, whether it be government or insurance companies or whatever. Parties have a greater incentive to take greater risks because their cost benefit analysis has changed. On the benefit side, the greater the risk, the greater the potential benefit, right? But if you have a reduced um, responsibility for bearing the responsibilities, the consequences of that risk, then you're reducing the costs of taking that risk. Or another way you can think about it is when you do a cost benefit analysis, you um, incur the costs of taking whatever action, and then the benefit is the expected benefit based on the probability of payoff versus not. Um, so, so yeah, that is one big way that um, we have screwed up the society in a way that is basically impossible to reverse without tearing down significant portions of it. And there is so much of there's so much in our society built around the financial system, and there's so much in the financial system that's based around insurance, whether it be insurance between companies and individuals, or insurance between um, government and individuals, or insurance between government and corporations. So, in short, the direction is towards nobody taking responsibility for anything. And where does that leave us? Who is left to take responsibility for the system? Because because an insurance company can't really prevent um, people from the insurance companies can't reduce the risks that people take without reducing their insurance coverage, basically, without actually reducing the insurance itself. So, for example, let's say that currently car insurance covers your property damage if you're drunk driving. That's not true, but let's just say that. Then the insurance company could, well, insurance companies are governed by law, so the government would have to change it so that the insurance company no longer covers property damage in cases of drunk driving. and then that's the only way to shift the incentive structure towards less drunk driving. Usually, it doesn't go in that direction. Usually, what happens is the drunk driving exemption from the insurance coverage is there to begin with, and the tendency is always towards more coverage and less exceptions rather than less coverage and more exemptions. There are some important exceptions to this, especially in the case of mandatory insurance. So a good example is back in 2013. So the last budget that Kathleen Wynne passed in minority government, the NDP was basically holding it hostage, and they ended up passing that budget and delaying the election another year by um, the NDP basically had their demand of, this is what we're going to get for our voters in exchange for our support for the Liberal government. So they said, okay, we demand that you lower auto insurance rates by 15%, because as much as insurance rates have gone up, these mandatory insurance rates is basically just a tax that's paid to a company uh, instead of a government. It's still a tax because you have to pay it no matter what. But the insurance company doesn't have any of like the democratic accountability that governments technically have. But anyways, what was I saying? Basically, what I'm saying is that if you follow all of these natural processes to their natural conclusions, you head towards the direction of nobody who has the control to reduce risks have the incentive to do so. And sometimes I think about grievance politics in terms of moral hazard as well. So, if everything is sexist and racist and that's why you're a failure, then you don't have any responsibility for your own future. And you don't have any responsibility for your past. Obviously, if you're talking about racial stereotypes that's based on things that happened in the past, then you don't have any responsibility for that. But then who are you putting that responsibility on? The per, everybody else? Then everybody else is responsible for your continued inability to create a better life for yourself. So then, it's really easy to see how that, just like government welfare, um, perverts the entire incentive structure. I think I had a lot more I wanted to say on this when I first made this note, but um, it's kind of escaping me right now where I wanted to really go with that particular sub point. And the other big moral hazard might be war. So, government's incentive to um, whether or not to wage war is becoming further and further removed from the people's will to wage war, and that's easy to see lots of examples of that as well. I'm pretty sure I had more to say about that as well, but um, I'm sure that will come up under another future topic anyway. Whatever I was wanting to say. So I want to move on to the idea that the world population has to come down. And I know that's quite a shift between talking about incentive structures getting screwed up, going to we need everybody to die. That's not what I'm saying. Um, Now, for context, I do know a number of people who believe in these theories that there's a global elite that is seeking to depopulate the earth for whatever reason. Sometimes it's lower population is easier to control, or it's actually actual concern for the climate, or um, there's other theories that I won't even mention on audio, but um, I wanted to basically address those kinds of sentiments because I share those sentiments in some ways. For example, I do think that uh, because of these diminishing marginal returns faced by our big civilization system. And because we have to basically deconstruct a lot of this big system in order to reconstruct it in a way where we can continue to um, grow as a species beyond this point. So basically, we got to take some steps back before we can take steps forward again. Because right now, there's too much resistance to those forward steps. Um, and basically, like subsystems eat each other up once a super system stagnates. So the more powerful subsystems can position themselves within this bigger system to be able to bring other subsystems under its control once scarcity inevitably creates enemies out of allies. And so the moral of that story or that idea is to always have a gun pointed at your ally's head, because one day they will become your enemy, because one day our mutual benefit from cooperation will decrease to the point where the incentive structures are reversed and scarcity has created enemies out of allies. So the basic premise behind any of these depopulation theories is that the elites, they have a gun pointed at our head for whatever reason. They want to move towards totalitarianism so that they can have more control, all of that kind of stuff. And depopulation might be on purpose. So um, some people I know were thinking that the COVID vaccine mandates was a depopulation plot. Um, I guess that's still yet to be seen technically, but um, the idea is that you make the system where everybody's forced to take vaccines, and then so whenever it's convenient, you can start killing off the population so they're not eating all your food once there's these huge food shortages. And then it might also be by negligence. So, I mean, it is possible that there are processes in play that will um, lead to depopulation in the future that the powers that be are just completely unaware of. We're blindly walking into it. So, I messaged a couple people this week, and the gist of the message was basically it kind of seems like there are powers at play that are trying to manufacture some sort of crisis. I mean, it's not like there's been any shortage of crisis, but there seems to be this. In my opinion, there's a lot of incentive to try to make these um, crises continue. And some ways it might be, they could there could be another epidemic, or they could finally admit what they know about food shortages and transition into food rationing. And you can also obviously you can attach all sorts of conditions, like eventually you'll have to pledge allegiance to the regime to get your daily loaf of bread, if there is a daily loaf of bread. And that's where it gets to the second part of what I was saying is um, it might be that they're trying to manufacture a crisis to create greater control, but because they're incompetent, they will inadvertently walk into a real crisis that overpowers their manufactured crisis. Um, and it kind of relates to what I said last week about the forces of anarchy and the forces of totalitarianism being in tension with each other. So the forces of totalitarianism would be the intentional crisis uh, to justify more authoritarian measures, and the forces of anarchy would be basically um, acts of God that might destabilize the system too much for their plans to actually work out. And there is a third possibility, which is just willful blindness. Maybe we started walking into these crises at first, but now maybe they've actually smartened up to it and never let a good crisis go to waste. Now they've basically got to milk the crisis for everything that it has, so that they come out the other side with as much new power as possible that they'll never give up. So like um, like after 9/11, how the government massively expanded their surveillance powers. And I'm not saying that 9/11 was an inside job. Maybe it was a willful blindness job, though. Now, the thing is with intentional depopulation narratives, all right? I don't want to say conspiracy theory because a conspiracy theory is only a theory until it turns out to be true. Not that they're all true, but I'm going to call them intentional depopulation narratives, okay? The idea that the elites are colluding to depopulate the earth. The problem with that is it assumes too much competence on behalf of the elites, right? Like if we had such smart elites, then how come we have governments that literally can't manage their way out of a cardboard box, huh? Everything that the government touches um, goes to shit, basically. Like they can never solve a problem without creating more problems. And I went into a little bit of some of the reasons why that is in last week's broadcast. Now, now you got to remember that humans are incompetent, and groups of humans are actually consciously more incompetent, even if they are subconsciously more competent. So what I mean by that is um, when you have, for example, a free market, everybody just kind of acting according to their own self-interest somewhat balances itself out in aggregate. But on the other hand, if you try to micromanage that system, then the incompetence is actually greater than um, at the individual level. Because when you're trying to make micromanaging decisions for a complex system with many individuals, you have to uh, make the decision based on the aggregate, cost benefit from all of these individuals, but you can't actually know um, the particulars of that. Um, so like a really really simplified example, okay? Um, Me and my wife, we can we can never decide where to eat, right? It's where do you want to eat? Where do you want to eat? That classic shit. Um, Now, you can consider that a sort of level of incompetence. We are not competent to efficiently come up with what to eat. Um, but perhaps you've noticed once you have more people, right? Sometimes it becomes. So let's say you have a whole group. You know what? I'm going to restart this example. Let's say you alone as an individual are deciding where to eat lunch. You can pretty competently make that decision, right? Maybe you come to regret that decision, so it's not completely competent, but for the most part, what more can you ask for, right? But if you alone are deciding where to eat for a whole group of people, then the probability that the decision you make being the best decision becomes lower and lower as you get more and more people, right? If you have a group of four friends, maybe you know them well enough, and you know everybody's favorite place to eat, so you can actually predict what the outcome would have been if you had voted. But if you have like a whole event of 200 people that you're catering for, then your chances of choosing the best option for that group of people is very very low compared to certain systems of voting. I say certain systems of voting because certain systems of voting are obviously very ineffective at coming up with a decision that reflects the whole. Um, so I was saying that the intentional depopulation narratives assume too much competence, and so my argument is that they're better explained by emergent properties. Now, emergent properties um, are things that arise um, from the aggregate of from they're properties that emerge from there being a group of things rather than there being one thing. So an emergent property you know, is is a single molecule of water a liquid? Arguably, no. A water only becomes liquid. Liquid is an emergent property of the aggregate of many water molecules interacting together, right? And so, from a human perspective, an emergent property might be the invisible hand of the free market, right? That you don't have an internal free market within yourself, but even if you had a group of 10 people who um, like to buy and sell things, then you kind of have a free market there. I mean, it doesn't really work because the that market would be so heavily influenced by the outside market, like outside prices, right? Because it's in competition with that. So let's say the whole economy as a whole, right? There as much as it's been perverted, we still have price signals based on supply and demand. My point is that you can't have price signals based on supply and demand when you have one person. It's an emergent property based on the aggregate of the interactions between people. Another emergent property might be religion. Now, religion, you can have religion with one person, right? But I'm counting religion as an emergent property in the sense that when you have a group of people, religion and religion-like ideas naturally arise. They emerge from the aggregate interactions of people. And that's the same thing with nationalism. I mean, nationalism is kind of related to religion in a way, but um, if you only had, you can isolate one person and find the nationalism within that one person. But if that one person is the only person in existence, then the nationalism doesn't make sense. Nationalism only makes sense from the perspective of there being an aggregate for that nationalist spirit to arise from. And sometimes these emergent properties have a life of their own, um, like a collective consciousness. So different cultures can kind of act like a collective consciousness in a way. Now, I actually think that some conspiracy theories. Well, I said I wouldn't say conspiracy theories. These narratives that are put out are actually psyops, psychological operations by the government that misplace the focus and make you feel hopeless. So, um, I mean, I can think the first example I think of is actually the opposite, which is the QAnon theories about how the government was going to install Donald Trump as president instead of Joe Biden, and that stuff was so silly that I had to think that that was that might have been set in motion. All you have to do is roll the snowball down the hill, um, and this I'm saying the snowball is maybe the intelligence community um, wanted to reduce the anger, like the spirit of let's ensure that Joe Biden doesn't become president. um, they wanted to basically release some of that pressure by creating this narrative of, oh, you don't have to do an insurrection because um, the army's on it. The army knows that there was an election fraud, and they'll make sure that everything turns out for the better. So you don't have to worry about it. You can just sit at home. But you know, more commonly, it's the other way. I think where I mean, so that if you consider that a psychological operation, then that definitely, um, was a diversion for, a purpose that's it's a diversion. And going back to the intentional depopulation narratives, um, if that these theories that there are like like the theories that like the Jews are trying to kill all of the rest of us by creating this totalitarianism, and they are so competent that they have, um, you know, gathered up ownership of all of the governments of the world through their central banking systems and control them, and they are basically um, trying to create the system where they can micromanage every little aspect without that system collapsing on itself, basically. Um, I think one of the perverse effects that those conspiracies have is that it makes people feel hopeless. So I mean, there is a particular couple that that is brought to mind when I talk about this, which they, are seem to be feeling so hopeless um, by the fact that basically they think that totalitarianism is coming and that there's nothing that we can do to prepare for it or stop it, basically. And the real problem with that is that it completely kills any incentive to try to prepare yourself for it. And I guess like what the message I want to um, be able to present to those individuals when I see them next is that people are really incompetent. I mean, let's say there's all these evil plots at play. Let's say there actually is these conspiracies going on. Um, you always have to properly evaluate the possibility that their plans will fail because the world is a complicated system and people sitting in a room just you know can't predict outcomes where you know there's the idea of the butterfly effect. Butterfly flapping its wings in Japan, creating a snowball effect and causing a major storm on the other side of the world. So the point is that the world is a big, complicated place full of incompetent fools, and um, if you look at these theories in that light, you can kind of see that um, you're really you're really playing into the hands of these people by seeing them as kind of like these superhuman gods. And maybe if they actually had that much competence, then they actually should be running the world. Maybe that's better than what we have now, um, even if that's disadvantageous for ourselves from an individual perspective. Um, the point is, I'm against totalitarianism, and a lot of people are against totalitarianism exactly because people can't predict outcomes in complicated systems, and micromanagement can't really be done in a competent way, and it always leads to tremendous, tremendous human suffering that a lot of it is intergenerational and maybe even permanent. Like Chinese culture, I think that is permanently bastardized. Like culture built up over thousands of years, totally permanently perverted, perhaps, um, or partially perverted. I won't say totally perverted, but partially perverted in very significant ways um, by um, by basically like 20, 30 years of communist rule. It's really what it took. And that goes back into what I was saying last week about how it's really hard to make a complicated system better and really easy to make it worse. It's always going to be easier to reduce complexity than to create it. Um, Now I'm going to try to relate that back to moral hazard because it's part of the reason why we can't allow totalitarianism, because centralized, over centralized command, um, it basically creates a perverse incentive not to care about human life. So that increases suffering. And it doesn't even increase sustainability because even though it might seem like more authoritarian governments are more stable, um, they basically put their eggs in one basket. So when the humans in charge are eventually wrong, the consequences are huge because that damage can't really be contained. And I say humans are eventually wrong, and that's a when, not an if. Um, and authoritarian leaders also have less incentive to identify problems and find real solutions. So the problems can add up and catch up to them while they're busy trying to paper over them or brush them under the rug. So there is a pretty good quote by Vladimir Putin about how um, the Soviet Union collapsed because um, because of hubris. You know, they had all of these different problems arising, and they would just brush them under the rug, paper them over, come up with temporary solutions. We're the Soviet Union. You know, what could happen to us? You know, we have such our government controls this whole um, grand country. You know, what could possibly you know, this little issue isn't going to this little issue about corruption, this little issue about these little inefficiencies here and there isn't really going to stop us from exercising our absolute authority. But that turned out to be false because these different issues add up, and then they reach a threshold, and then the damage is done, and there's then processes come into play that you know you can't really reverse without significant decentralization. And you know, significant decentralization and collapse are basically synonyms. Um, and Putin's point was that the U.S. is going through the same thing. The U.S. is showing great hubris. They're basically acting as if they're invincible, and even if there are real problems going on, like inflation, fuck it, just lie and say that it's transitory, right? We'll get through it. We're the fucking United States. Um, but you know, there are always forces stronger than the forces of man. You know, and um, it kind of reminds me of the story of the Tower of Babel, where you know the story of the Tower of Babel is a story where the humans forget about God and they decide that they will become God and they will build this tower up to heaven so that they can become God. And then God gets petty and angry that the humans are trying to become powerful and good and better. So God uh, confounds their speech so that they can't speak to each other, so they can't work on this project anymore. Um, and that's how the different languages of the world arose. And so this is sometimes seen as like an archaic myth to explain the origin of languages, and that it kind of portrays God as like an archaic conception of a petty, vengeful deity. I don't think that's the right way to think about this story, because you know, stories in the Bible have been around for thousands of years. So usually, the fact that they are still around, the way that Jordan Peterson explains it is that there's definitely some sort of resonance frequency there for this story to survive for thousands of years, whereas so many others didn't. Um, now, the Tower of Babel. What do I think is the moral of that story? Well, let me tell the story of the Tower of Babel in another way. The humans forgot the traditions that brought them to where they are, and so they decided that through conscious effort and central planning, they could do better than those traditions. And so just through cooperation, they could collectively um, basically create this new um, force that could act like a deity. But you know, something happened, and it all got screwed up. And the way that I apply that moral to the current state of society is that um, never mind the fact that we are um, abandoning religion, you know, broadly speaking, as a Western society, but we are also abandoning the underlying substratum. Um, there are, whether you like it or not, a substratum of Protestant values that underpin the culture that built this Western society, and we are pretty much deconstructing that, right? I mean, that's why um, the the far left, they talk about dismantling patriarchy, dismantling white supremacy, dismantling capitalism. You know, this is basically the sentiment of the Cultural Revolution in China to basically strengthen authoritarian rules. kill the old culture. The old culture is archaic. Us through our intellect, through the intellect that we gain from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we can do better than where our traditions have brought us. So let's abandon those traditions. So we abandon those traditions, and we seek to create a new deity out of our government because we want to become God now, right? Um, so this kind of explains why you see government trying to micromanage every single aspect of your life, even what you can say, what you can't say, even to your own children or your parents. Um, this is really a case of whether I think this is, something subconscious going on a big aggregate societal level. But what's going on is we are forgetting about God. We are forgetting about our traditions, and we are seeking to create our own God through a state that micromanages um, society to create the best outcome. Um, and as a result, we've lost touch with our um, baseline sense of reality. And as a result, you've seen such polarization between left and right, man and woman, old and young, to the point where, and black and white and whatever, to the point where it's like you're speaking another language, right? I mean, when you try to talk to somebody who is still on the mainstream narrative completely, um, at first it's like speaking another language to them. When you say something to them, you almost have to translate yourself. Um, and and those of us that aren't on the mainstream narrative, we tend to be um, bilingual, but one-way communication doesn't suffice in a society. So the idea is that um, getting a little repetitive towards the end here, but I'm just going to sum it up by saying we forgot about God, we forgot about our traditions. We think we can do better than our traditions and create a God out of our governments, uh, and eventually an international government. And as a result of this attempt, we have lost our sense of reality, and now different aspects of our society can't communicate with each other. So we are doomed to fracture ourselves until the forces of God crush the forces of man, and we are forced to come to terms with the reality that we have for so long sought to ignore and suppress. So that's it for this week. I'll thanks for tuning in again if you have, and hopefully you'll tune in again next week.